Welcome to another Avid tutorial. This one is going to be on effects, specifically effects working with the visual side in Avid. I mentioned in the audio tutorial that's separate how to do some audio effects within Avid. And the main thing I would say up front is Avid has a pretty strong palette of effects available and things that you can do here. And there's nothing wrong with that, particularly if it's something pretty straightforward or simple that you're doing. The more complex whatever you're trying to do is, the more I might suggest you want to go into a program that's specifically designed for that. Something like After Effects if you're doing visual effects and compositing sorts of things, something like DaVinci Resolve if you're working with color grading. And in some cases, those are going to give you actually more power, some things you can do in there that you won't be able to do natively in Avid. And in other cases, you may be able to do it in Avid, but it just might be more user-friendly or easier to accomplish or easier to tweak exactly what you're doing in some of that other software. Just starting with that at the outset, that I'm going to show you how to access some of these things, and there's some that you will probably use pretty regularly in Avid, some basic resizing or adjusting your masking or things like that. But there are also other things that it might just be easier and more efficient to go into other software if you know it. On the other hand, if you know how to use the Avid software and don't know some other programs, it may be quicker for you to just do it in here live. So got a sort of simple interview shot here. This is shot in log mode on the Sony FS7, which is why it looks pretty washed out. And we'll actually take a look at the color in a little bit and see what we can do with that. But let's start with some basic things about just how we access some of these and work with effects. So if I go into my effects palette, which is Command 8, or I have mine open over here, I have all kinds of different filters. So if I go to the All tab here, you can kind of scroll through all the different effects things you can do. And filters is how generally effects are going to be done in Avid, with the exception of some things that are transitions. So if I'm transitioning from one shot to another, then I might be using some of these. And the way I would do that would just be take this transition and I'm going to drag it to the transition between those two shots. And in this case, since it's the same shot that I just put a cut in, you probably won't actually see anything happen. See if we can find something that would be more obvious just so you can see the difference. Okay, so traditional sort of page peel cheesy effect, I want to do something like that. So you can see I just dropped it on the cut and it does this. If I need to adjust the effect itself, the details of it, I can pull up my effect editor. I just use my keyboard shortcut for it. It's also available here in Tool Effect Editor right there. And you can see here's the options for this particular thing. I could reverse it. I could swap what's happening with what. I could turn right instead of left. Whatever. I'm going to look a lot more in the effects editor in a little bit. But so that's how I access my transitions. Filters are the same way. These are going to be effects, and you can always scroll through all of them, or you can look specifically for the type of effect you are looking for. So I know one I use a lot is resize, and I know that's an image, so this is a quick way to get to it. I can also go up here and type in the search bar, resize, and it'll show up there. So if there's something in particular you're looking for, like I know it's something to do with color, let me type in color and see what my options are there. You can also access things that way. So let's start with a simple resize. This is a very common one. I'm going to take this and I'm just going to drop it on the clip. So you can see I bring it down here and this turns white, highlights, and now that is on the clip. And if I kind of zoom out, you can see it shows here on the clip. Different effects will have different icons. So this one, the resize, has a plus. If I do color corrector later, you'll see that has a different sort of look. Some of them will just have this sort of default in Avid plugin icon. So those are just kind of those icons that will show up. And the green dot means it's an effect that hasn't been rendered yet, but that does not need to be rendered to play. So some effects you'll see have that green dot. So in the case of this transition, that's telling me Avid can process this live. So even without rendering it, if I play through it, I will see the effect there. If something has a blue dot on it, that means it's an effect that Avid can't process live. It's going to need to process it ahead of time, create a new piece of media, and basically play that media instead. If I am in a situation like that, let's say I wanted to render this transition, you could set an in and out around it, go to my timeline menu, And under render, I'm going to select render in to out. And so it's going to render everything between that in and out point. It's going to ask what drive I want to go to, tell me there's some effects to render. Okay, let's go ahead and do it. And when that came up, there was an option that said application render or background render. Application means it's going to do this, kind of stop everything else and just render it. That's the fastest way to do it, but also keeps me from doing any other work while that's happening. If I go to a background render, it'll let me keep editing and keep working, but it'll take longer for that effect to actually get rendered and processed. So that's the difference there. So now you can see that green dot went away. So blue dot would mean it's something that needs to be rendered before we can see it. Green dot means it hasn't been rendered, but we can see it anyway. And no dot means it was actually created that media. We can see the effect, and it's now baked in there. If I change this effect or change anything else about the edit around here, that may get erased and need to be re-rendered because I've changed the footage that it's dealing with. So let's say I went into this transition and just like adjusted a few frames. You'll see now this is green again because now that I've changed exactly what frames are happening while that page peel is happening, it's going to need to re-render that effect. So that's the idea there. Let's actually delete this. If I want to get rid of an effect, I can use the no smoking or remove effect sign and take that out there. Take out my in and out from here. Let's go back to this resize. So I put the effect on here, but it didn't actually seem to affect anything. Some of these effects over here will immediately do something, you'll immediately see the effect. A lot of them will not. A lot of them need you to adjust the settings and tell them kind of what you want it to do before they're actually going to do anything. So don't be surprised if you put something on and it does have an immediate effect, but don't be surprised if you put something on and it doesn't. So in this case, I put on a resize, and let's see, I want to edit this. I'm going to go into my effect editor. Again, that was under tools, effect editor here. And it's going to pull up whatever clip my cursor was over. So I don't have to be right over this pink box, but I would need to be somewhere along this clip if that's the effect I want to work on. And I need to have this track active. So if I turn this off, you'll see now there's nothing available here. Turn this back on. Now this comes up. So let's see the options I have here for the resize effect. I can do scaling, I can adjust the position, and I can crop it. So let's say, for instance, that we're like, oh, you know, we really just kind of shot this a little too wide. We want to punch in on her face a little bit. And we got some 4K footage, and we're just finishing in HD, so we have some extra spare resolution to deal with. So I could scale this up a little bit. If you do the math, if you had UHD footage, technically you could blow it up to 200% and you'd kind of have exactly HD resolution left. That does start to be noticeable, even if you're finishing in HD, compared to other footage that was kind of at true UHD full resolution, and then you just did an output in HD. So I generally wouldn't recommend pushing it that far, but usually 150% I can certainly push to if I'm working with UHD footage and blowing it up. And okay, so let's say I like the scale of that, but I don't like how it's kind of cropping off her head now, so I could adjust the position and kind of get that. Let's say, you know, just cut off the very top there, that looks okay. And then, you know, let's also say, hypothetically, if I was doing this in, you know, a narrower aspect ratio or something like that, or if there's part of the footage I didn't want, I can also adjust the crop here and, you know, crop off whatever chunk of the footage I didn't want. Now that's not cropping my finished video, it's just cropping this image here. So I'll see this black bar here if I don't do anything else about that.
I do want to quickly point out something about the resize effect that's not entirely obvious. When you see it can do such effects as scaling and positioning and cropping, one of the things you might think is, oh, this would be great for split screening. So for instance, if I wanted to have one shot on one side of the screen and another shot showing on the other side of the screen, I can sort of reposition things and crop them to do that. You know, I could take this shot, put it up here, and imagine that now if I adjust the resize on this one, I can see the image beneath it and end up seeing both of them on screen at the same time. This actually isn't the way that the resize effect works. So if I crop off part of this image, you'll see we just see black underneath it. If I scale it down, we just see black underneath it. We do not see this other image that actually lays below it. And the reason is the resize actually treats the whole background as black, and when you're cropping, it's kind of covering those parts of the image with black pixels. And you can change the color here in the background. But it's using that color to fill in any missing parts of image. It's not actually removing parts of the image or shrinking it to show you what's underneath it. So if I want to do a split screen, just wanted to show you this quick, I'm actually going to take off the resize effect and I'm going to put on a different effect called picture in picture. So if I do a search for that here, you'll see it shows up, picture in picture blend, and I'll drop this clip on here. And as soon as I do it, you can tell it's different because the default for this is it immediately scales the image down to 50% so I can see what's laying beneath it. If I pull up my effects here, you can see it's scaled down to 50%. So I could do that and put multiple images around the screen. But in this case, if I want to do sort of like a side-by-side, I'm going to leave this at 100% scale, but pan one of these over a little bit and crop off a little bit on the side of it. And then I can use either another copy of the picture-in-picture effect, or I could use the traditional resize on the bottom clip. I'll just use picture-in-picture again since I already have this up. And again, it's going to scale it down to 50%. Now it's showing black behind it because there is no shot under it. But I can fix that by just pulling this back to 100% and moving this over to the side. Now I've got both images playing next to each other in a traditional split screen. I can also keyframe this just as you would expect. So I could keyframe, and have the cropping move, have the scaling move, have the positions move around if I wanted to be kind of changing the split screen or having something moving around and the framings are changing. But that would be the way you do a split screen. So I just wanted to point out the resize looks like a good candidate for that, but that's not actually the right effect for doing any sort of multiple images on screen. You want to use this picture-in-picture effect. And with that said, I'm going to undo all of this and let's get back to where we were with the resizing effect.
So that's a simple effect. Now, the other thing I do have the power to do, and I don't personally think the interface for this in Avid is super great, but it is there. Oftentimes when you pull up the effect editor, you'll just see something like this, kind of your basic effects to change. And if you pull it out wider, you see this blue part come out here on the side. This is showing you where in the clip you are. So you can see I can go to the beginning of the clip or go to the end of the clip. And I can keyframe from here too. So let's say I wanted this clip to sort of gradually zoom in on her, like get the effect of a zoom, even though we're just doing it digitally with a push and post. So let's actually bring this back and say, I want to start at kind of my original resolution, and we got to reposition this so it's not kind of cropped off. So I'm going to start here, and here's my pink triangle, which is always add keyframe. I'm going to select that, and it gives me the option to add it to all the open groups, add it to active groups, the active parameter I was just working on. I'm just going to add it to all the open groups. Let's keyframe everything here. And okay, so then we want to sort of gradually zoom in. Let's say by this point we want it zoomed in, and then we're going to sort of set it down, stop there. So I'm going to do that. And I always have to have two keyframes to make any change. So I have to tell it where am I going from and where am I going to. So anytime you just have one keyframe, you can't actually make anything change. And you can change it, but it won't change over time. If I adjust the scale and I only have one keyframe, it's going to stay that scale from the beginning of the clip to the end. I always have to have a place runtime to start, a place runtime to end. But now that I've got that, so at the start, I basically have my original shot. And I'm going to say, by the time we get to the end here, this is where I want us to be scaled up to 150%. Oops, I didn't have that selected. Okay, and I also need to adjust this positioning to not crop that head so much. Okay, so now I've told it where it's starting and where it's going to, and now as we play through the clip, and I forgot to tell it to make this one stay there at 100. This is, again, I'm not a huge fan of the interface here in Avid. Okay, now we got it working. And you can see it's sort of gradually pushing in on her, and if we play this at real time. It's called Webback Fitness Logs. These are logs that residents can pick up at the beginning of each semester, and they have certain there a little bit, you can see. But we see that sort of change in scale. So that's how I can keyframe an effect in here. So that's an option that you have available to you with any effect, and most of the settings and most of the effects can be keyframed if you want to do so. And once that's done, I still have this green dot here. So again, this will need to be rendered before I do the final output. You can kind of see the difference in scale here from where we zoomed in to where we zoomed back out. Another common one you may want to play with is the color corrector. So there's a couple of ways to get to this. I'll show you the sort of effect way first, and then I'll show you a different way that I think is more effective in terms of color correction if you're going to do some of that in Avid. So I can grab the color correction effect and just drop it on a clip, just like any other effect. And just like any other effect, I can then go to my effect editor, and I can see the options from this. And you can see there's a lot of settings for this. I can kind of keep dropping down, even without the keyframing stuff. You can see there's a lot of submenus and stuff in here. And I could say, okay, let's add some saturation to this. That's an insane amount of saturation. Let's adjust our saturation and gain and our gamma. And now we've changed the image from this to this. That is one way where I can access my color correction settings. Just put an effect on here and do that. Now there is a better built-in color correction system that uses the same effect, so it's going to end up looking the same on my timeline, like I have a color corrector effect on here, but it is going to do it in a way where I can access the controls more easily and kind of see what I'm doing. And that's my color correction workspace. So hit that, I am into the workspace, and I have three monitors here that I can choose what they're showing. So right now it's saying, here's what was in the previous shot, here's the current shot you're working on, here's what the next shot is going to look like. And this is so that if I'm trying to match from shot to shot, I can see, here's what this was, okay, here's what's coming up next, and here's where I am right now, and make these sort of match across. But I also have other views I could show here. So if I wanted to see what the waveform view looks like and kind of get a sense of what I might need to do to the grade, I can do that. If I wanted to pull up a vector scope, I have that. If I want to do sort of all of my tools at once, so vector scope, histogram, parade, and a waveform, I can do all of those. So I get all these view options here. And that makes it a little easier to do some of these things. So say, okay, I can see where I need to pull that, and pull up the gain, and let's see just a little bit down there. And now let's saturation, maybe not that much. Contrast, and so I can set it down just a little bit more. Yeah, and now I've got something that maybe looks a little bit better. I can store color corrections here. I can do match coloring. I can do traditional with gamma gain, so lows, mids, highs. So if I just want to shift kind of the brightest parts, let's say magenta, you can see what that's doing. Brightest part coming here, this one, and warm up midtones. Clear the darks a little bit. You can see what that's doing, how it's just affecting those. Okay, I still don't think this is as easy or intuitive to use as something like DaVinci Resolve that was really built as a color corrector and then they added other stuff to it later. But I have a pretty robust set of tools here that I can use. I also have access to all my curves, so if I just want to kind of push my brights and push my darks kind of a little more extreme, a more contrasty look, I can do something like that and see there's different weights on there. So that's the color corrector, and it's kind of the one effect that really has its own completely different interface. So that looks like we brought it roughly back to normal. Again, if it's log footage, another way we could have done that was just throwing on a LUT, but doing simple color correction that looks relatively close to right. There's our original, as we color it to. Okay, so the color corrector kind of has its own thing going on. All the other effects you're just going to access through the normal effect editor. Now, something that I know commonly comes up, particularly when you're dealing with media that you're bringing in from other sources. So for instance, in the editing class, if you're working on a trailer project, you might be grabbing clips from different movies or different sources online that come in different sort of aspect ratios. And so let me show you a couple things you can do with that. One is you can, of course, use the resize tool that we already looked at and just sort of crop some things to wherever you want them to be and adjust your crops that way. That's not really the most efficient way to get the same aspect ratio across a whole video, but it is one possibility, and it's a tool that's in there and that works. Another thing is you can actually set masking for your whole project. So if I bring up my project preferences, you'll see there's this option down here that says mask margins. And I can say, okay, this is a 16:9 project, but what do I want to mask it to? And let's say we're shooting for 239. You can do that and apply. And it's going to show me, here's my frame in its entirety. So I can still kind of see the whole thing, see all the footage I have access to, but then I'm going to see these partially grayed bars showing me here's what your 239 image is going to look like. And then when I go to do my output, so let's just pretend for the moment this sequence was done, and I'm just going to export it. In my export options, I have an option to enable the mask margins, and that'll just burn in these masks, and it will actually make them full black masks, not this sort of like partial mask where we can still see what's behind it. That's just for our editing purposes. This would actually just burn them in. So that's always an option I have. Another thing I could do is I could put an effect of a mask across the entire project. So far I've shown you that we can drag effects onto clips and it affects that clip. This is one of the places where it turns out to be kind of handy to us remembering that Avid is designed with no such thing as empty space. And so anytime you see empty space, it's really this clip called filler. So I'm going to make a new track above all these, and I'll move my viewer up so that I'm seeing what's on track V2. So it looks like empty space, but this is actually one long clip that runs the length of my project that is just filler. And I could grab a mask and put that mask over that whole shot. And now that is masking my entire video. So the original footage is still there under it, but this is masking the whole thing. I don't actually buy that that's a 185 mask. I think that's a 185 mask for 4:3 image. That's why, because this looks more like a 239. Anyway, that's a common trick. I can do the same thing, by the way, with color correction. So if there's some color effect I want to apply to the entire video, in fact, let's do a simple example of that. Let me make another video track. Let's move this up here, because we still want that widescreen bars on top of everything. Go back into color for a second. Let's say that this color grade that I put on, if I have a whole bunch of footage, which in this case, this whole track is all the same clip, that I want to apply the same thing to, I could save this color grade. I'm going to go over there and hold down Option and click on this. So I save that as grade number 1. And now I'm going to say I want to apply this effect to track V2. So I turned off V1, turned on V2, and it's going to apply it to the clip we're on, which is this empty filler clip here that runs the whole length. And so I'm going to end up with that color grade across my entire movie. So if I scroll through here, you can see it's now in the whole thing. Now in this case, over here, we have 2 copies of it. That's why this is looking super distorted. So let's go back to track V1 and just remove that so we only have 1 copy of the effect. And now I just put that same color grade across my entire sequence. If I had a entire movie, even if it's not all one shot, that all was shot in log mode, and I had a color grade that was essentially to correct that back to normal or to get it to a particular look I want, I could do something like this and get myself at least in the ballpark of where I want to be for the whole movie, and then do some fine tuning. So this is something I've often found very useful, is placing effects on quote unquote empty video tracks above the main thing. It's a great way to throw on some widescreen bars. It's a great way to do a sort of simple color effect across the whole thing. It's also a place you could do titles. There's a separate tutorial on the titler tool, but if I made a title and throw it in one of these, then I can lay it over as much or as little of the entire project as I want. I think that's about as far as I want to go here. You can see there are tons of transitions and effects that you can play with within Avid, but in terms of sort of your general creative editing, most of the time the ones you're going to be doing are sort of simple resize. You might sometimes need to do a flop, And if you look at these, they kind of show you what they each do. Flip is flip it vertically. Flip flop is basically like flip it 180 degrees over, like rotate it 180 degrees. Flop is actually fairly common. Let's say that somebody on set kind of messed up the continuity and you jump the 180 at some point, but there's no other clues in the background. Or you're trying to get two shots that really shouldn't match. Maybe they were from different movies. Maybe they're just from different scenes where people were sitting in different positions, but you're trying to get it where you're creating a fake eye line, like two people are looking at each other, or one of them's looking at something. That's a common place you might use a flop. So I put this on here, you're just going to see she flips left to right. So that's all the flop does, but that's a handy thing if someone had been like over here and they're looking off to the right, now they're over here and they're looking off to the left, and that's a way you can help make some screen directions and eye lines match. You're welcome to play with any of the others of these, but I would say these ones under the image tab are kind of the most frequently used ones in just general creative editing where you're not even trying to do effects, you're just trying to get the story and such working, because that's where you have your resize and your flop, which are probably the most common ones to use. And then obviously you have a mask you could put on if you want, or you could also use the mask margin setting back here. And that's our basics of effects in Avid. Hope that is helpful.